What if a museum holds not just history but the lives of those tied to it? When Sarah Monroe moves to the small town of Lincoln, she has no idea that the ancient artifacts in its forgotten museum don't just reflect the past, they control the future. Why has her family been connected to this museum for generations? What secrets do old mirrors, broken compasses, and dusty relics hide? Chapter 1: Arrival. The bus came to a slow halt, its engine groaning in protest as Sarah Monroe stood to gather her belongings. The coastal fog hung thick in the air outside, making it impossible to see the full extent of the small town that was now her new home. Lincoln, Oregon. Population, just over 2,000. It was a far cry from the bustling city she had left behind, and exactly what she needed. Her last months in the city had been a blur of heartache and frustration. A failed relationship that left her more shattered than she cared to admit, combined with a stagnant job that no longer inspired her. Sarah craved a clean slate, a fresh start, something she hoped this quiet town would offer. As she stepped off the bus, the dampness of the coastal air settled into her bones. She pulled her jacket tighter around her body and glanced down the nearly deserted main street. Shops with peeling paint, an old diner with a flickering neon sign, and a handful of locals who paid her little mind. It was a town that had seen better days, but there was a charm in its simplicity. The fog created an ethereal glow around the buildings, almost as if the town existed in a bubble outside of time. It felt distant, removed from the real world. Yet, as Sarah took her first steps onto the cobblestone street, she felt something strange. A tug. A pull. It was subtle, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear, but enough to make her stop for a moment and glance around. Just nerves, she muttered to herself, shaking off the feeling. After all, moving to a new place and starting over was bound to stir up some anxiety. She pulled out her phone to check the address of the museum. It was only a short walk from the bus stop, nestled on the edge of town, near the cliffs that overlooked the churning Pacific Ocean. According to the research she had done, the museum had been built in the late 1800s by one of the town's founding families. It was a small, forgotten place now rarely visited by tourists, but its artifacts were well preserved, and it had been looking for a new curator for months. When Sarah had seen the job listing, it felt like fate. As she walked, the streets seemed to narrow, the fog swallowing up the distant sounds of the ocean. A stillness settled over the town, as if it was holding its breath. When Sarah finally reached the museum, she paused to take in the sight of the old building. It was smaller than she'd imagined, with weathered stone walls and narrow windows that gave it a brooding, almost Gothic appearance. A small wooden sign near the entrance read, "The Lincoln Historical Museum." She stood there for a moment, staring at the structure. The pull she had felt earlier was stronger now. It was as if the building was calling to her. She shook her head, chastising herself for being dramatic. This was supposed to be a fresh start, not a descent into some kind of eerie mystery. Yet, as she crossed the threshold and opened the heavy wooden door, the feeling of familiarity washed over her again, stronger this time. Inside, the museum was dimly lit, with the faint smell of old paper and wood polish. The air was cool, and the silence was almost oppressive. The front desk was empty, but the creak of a floorboard announced the presence of someone in the back room. Sarah stood awkwardly, glancing around at the display cases filled with dusty relics from the town's past. "Miss Monroe, I presume?" The voice startled Sarah, and she turned to see an elderly woman emerging from the shadows. Mrs. Patterson. She was exactly as Sarah had imagined, a small, wiry figure with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her grey hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a plain, buttoned-up cardigan that made her look like she had stepped out of another era entirely. "Yes, I'm Sarah. It's nice to meet you," Sarah replied, forcing a smile and extending her hand. Mrs. Patterson didn't take it, but instead gave a curt nod and motioned for Sarah to follow her deeper into the museum. "The museum isn't much these days, as I'm sure you've already heard," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying a hint of melancholy. But it has its charm and history, more than most care to know about. They walked down a narrow corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, presumably important figures in the town's history. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes were following her as she passed. Mrs. Patterson led her into a small office, cluttered with papers and books, and motioned for her to sit. "I'm grateful you took the position," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into her chair behind the desk. "Not many are interested in a place like this anymore. Too small, too forgotten. But it has stories to tell, if you know how to listen." Sarah tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Patterson smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "You'll see, in time. The museum has a way of revealing itself to those who are meant to be here." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, though she wasn't entirely sure why. It was just a job, after all. A stepping stone to rebuild her life. And yet, there was something about this place, about Mrs. Patterson's cryptic words, that made her feel like she was on the cusp of something much larger than she had anticipated. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah wandered through the museum, familiarizing herself with the exhibits. She ran her fingers lightly over the glass cases, studying the old tools, faded maps, and tattered clothing on display. The artifacts felt oddly personal, though she had no reason to feel that way. It was as if they were connected to her, though she couldn't explain how or why. When she reached the far end of the museum, she stopped in front of a large, brass compass. It was encased in a simple wooden box, with a plaque that read, "Captain Jeremiah Ellison, 1882. The compass was tarnished, the needle stuck in place. But as Sarah leaned in closer to inspect it, the needle suddenly twitched. Then, without warning, it spun wildly, as if pulled by some invisible force. She stepped back, startled, her heart pounding. She glanced around, but the museum was empty. There was no one else there. "Just stress," she whispered to herself. "It's just stress." But as she stood there, staring at the compass, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Something unseen, but very much present. She left the museum that day with more questions than answers, and as she walked back through the fog-laden streets of Lincoln, she couldn't help but feel that she hadn't just found a job. She had found a mystery. What do you think of Sarah's first step into this new and mysterious world? What secrets does Lincoln and its strange museum hide, and how might they shape her future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where do you think her fate will lead her? Don't forget to like if you're intrigued by the beginning and subscribe to stay updated on the story. Chapter 2: The Artifacts. The morning sun filtered weakly through the museum's narrow windows as Sarah sat at a small wooden desk, flipping through the thick catalogue of the museum's inventory. Each page listed items housed within the museum's walls, along with brief descriptions of their origins and historical relevance. But as Sarah read through the entries, something didn't feel quite right. The descriptions were dry, factual, but when she touched each object, she felt something deeper, as if the artifacts themselves held stories waiting to be uncovered. The museum was eerily silent this early in the day. The only sound came from the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath her feet as she moved from one exhibit to the next. Dust swirled in the golden shafts of light, giving the room an almost dreamlike quality. She started with the most innocuous of objects, a pair of old spectacles, the lenses cracked and tarnished. The card attached to them stated they had belonged to a local schoolteacher in the early 1900s, but when Sarah held them in her hands, she felt a strange warmth, a flicker of recognition that made her pause. It was a feeling she couldn't quite put into words, something like déjà vu, but more intense. One by one, Sarah catalogued the objects, though her mind kept wandering back to the unsettling sensations she experienced when she touched them. The compass from the day before, the cracked mirror, and the locket in the corner case all seemed to pulse with an energy that none of the other items had. The compass in particular caught her attention again. It was brass, tarnished, and old. Its needle was frozen in place most of the time, but on occasion, she had seen it twitch as though trying to find some hidden magnetic pull. Sarah picked it up, feeling the cool metal against her palm. The moment she touched it, the needle jumped, spinning in erratic circles before settling on a direction. Her breath caught in her throat. "That's odd," she whispered, glancing around as if someone might be watching her. The museum was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. She carefully set the compass back in its case and turned her attention to the cracked mirror. Its ornate frame was made of dark, carved wood, and the surface of the glass was marred by a long crack that ran from corner to corner. When Sarah peered into it, her reflection looked distorted, stretched in unnatural ways, as if the crack was warping her image. But something about the reflection felt wrong. It was her face, her body, but there was a shadow at the edge of the glass, something just out of view, and it made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "Mrs. Patterson?" Sarah called out as she walked toward the back office. She found the older woman sorting through boxes of old newspapers, her hands nimble despite her age. "Yes, dear?" Mrs. Patterson didn't look up from her work. "I've been cataloguing some of the artifacts, and I couldn't help but notice." Sarah hesitated, unsure how to phrase her question without sounding ridiculous. "It's just, some of these items, they feel strange. I don't know how else to describe it." Mrs. Patterson paused, her fingers stilling over the brittle pages. She slowly looked up, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Sarah's. "Strange, you say?" "Yes. Like they're more than just old objects. It's silly, I know, but it's almost like they're alive. Or like they're watching me." Mrs. Patterson let out a low hum, a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement. "People often feel that way about things they don't understand, Miss Monroe. That's the nature of history. It has a way of lingering in the things it leaves behind." "Why doesn't anyone come here?" Sarah asked, suddenly aware of how empty the museum always was. "There's so much to see, so much to learn, but no one ever visits." "People, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice soft but deliberate, "are afraid of what they don't understand." Sarah's curiosity deepened. She wanted to ask more, to pry into what exactly Mrs. Patterson meant, but something about the way the older woman turned back to her work made it clear that the conversation was over. Sarah returned to the exhibit floor, her mind swirling with questions. As the day went on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The artifacts seemed to hum with energy, subtle but persistent. When she touched them, it was as if they were trying to communicate with her, to tell her something she couldn't yet understand. She moved to the final object in her catalogue for the day, the locket. It was small, delicate, and tarnished with age. The chain had broken long ago, but the locket itself still opened easily, revealing a tiny, faded portrait inside. The portrait was of a woman Sarah didn't recognize, though the delicate features and old-fashioned hairstyle suggested the photograph was from the early 1900s. The inscription on the back of the locket was too worn to make out, but there was something haunting about the face in the portrait. Sarah held the locket in her hand, feeling its weight. As she stared at it, her vision blurred for a moment, and a wave of dizziness swept over her. She blinked and the sensation passed, but it left her feeling unsettled. The rest of the day passed in a haze, with Sarah working mechanically, her mind preoccupied with the strange sensations the artifacts had stirred in her. By the time the museum closed for the evening, she was exhausted emotionally and mentally drained from the strange pull of the objects around her. That night, Sarah's dreams were vivid and disorienting. She found herself on a ship, tossed about by violent waves in the middle of a storm. The sea roared around her, the wind howling in her ears as she clung to the ship's railing. In her hand, she held the brass compass, its needle spinning wildly, unable to find true north. She was lost at sea, with no land in sight, the storm growing stronger with each passing moment. When she woke the next morning, her heart was still pounding in her chest, and the memory of the dream clung to her like a shadow. She hadn't had that dream since she was a child, yet here it was again, vivid and terrifying. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself drawn back to the same objects, the compass, the mirror, the locket. Each time she touched them, she felt the same strange sensation, as if they were trying to tell her something, as if they held secrets she was on the verge of uncovering. Her conversations with Mrs. Patterson remained cryptic, the older woman offering little more than vague hints about the museum's history. "The objects here have stories, Mrs. Patterson would say, but not all stories are meant to be told." Sarah's curiosity grew with each passing day. The museum, which had once seemed like a quiet place to start over, now felt like a puzzle she needed to solve. There was something beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite see, but she could feel it lurking just beyond her understanding. And so, every day, she returned to the artifacts, studying them, touching them, trying to piece together the puzzle they were offering her. The compass, the mirror, the locket, they were the keys to something. She just didn't know what. But she would find out. She was sure of that. Chapter 3, Echoes. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, the sound of the ocean waves crashing in the distance, barely audible through the cracked window. It was early morning, and the sun had yet to burn through the fog that wrapped itself around the town like a shroud. She sipped her coffee slowly, her mind drifting back to the events of the past few days. The museum, the artifacts, the strange sensations she had felt when she touched them, it all weighed heavily on her. She had been in Lincoln for almost 2 weeks now, and while she had hoped for a peaceful escape, her time at the museum was anything but restful. The more she worked with the artifacts, the more she noticed how they seemed to affect her. Her dreams had grown more vivid, filled with images of the sea and voices she couldn't recognize. And then there were the coincidences, objects she was sure she had placed one way would appear differently the next day. The compass, the mirror, the locket, they all seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, as if they had a life of their own. Sarah shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was ridiculous. She was just stressed, overworked, and letting her imagination get the best of her. Yet, the feeling that something wasn't right persisted, gnawing at her in the quiet moments when she was alone. That afternoon, as she walked the foggy streets to the museum, the sense of unease grew. The town itself seemed off. The streets were emptier than usual, and the few people she did see seemed to avoid her gaze, hurrying along as if they didn't want to be noticed. Lincoln had always been quiet, but today, it felt desolate. When she reached the museum, Sarah was greeted by the familiar creak of the door and the faint smell of old wood and paper. She stepped inside, expecting to find Mrs. Patterson at the front desk, but the older woman was nowhere to be seen. Sarah made her way through the museum, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She paused in front of the cracked mirror, the same one that had unnerved her days before. The ornate frame looked darker today, the wood almost black as if it had been absorbing the shadows of the room. She stared into the glass, her reflection dim and distorted by the crack that split the mirror in two. As she leaned closer, something shifted. There, just behind her, was a figure. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing just out of view. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, her heart pounding. The room was empty. There was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, her pulse racing, but the shadow was gone. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only her reflection, pale and shaken, staring back at her. Later that day, Sarah met with Tom, the town's local historian, at the small diner down the street from the museum. Tom was in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent poring over dusty books and old documents. He had lived in Lincoln his whole life and knew more about the town's history than anyone else. "So, what can you tell me about the museum?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee absently as she tried to shake off the lingering unease from earlier. Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, the museum's been around for over a century. It was built by the Ellison family, one of the town's founders. They were a strange bunch, kept to themselves mostly. There's a lot of rumors about them, especially old Captain Ellison. Some say he was obsessed with the sea, thought it spoke to him. Spoke to him? Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. Tom nodded. Yeah, claimed he could hear voices in the waves, telling him things. People in town thought he was crazy. Then, one day, he just disappeared. Took his ship out to sea and was never seen again. Sarah's mind raced as Tom spoke. The brass compass in the museum had belonged to Captain Ellison. She had seen his name on the plaque. Could his disappearance have something to do with the strange feelings she had been experiencing? What about the artifacts in the museum? Sarah asked. Is there anything special about them? Tom shrugged. Depends on what you mean by special. Most of the stuff in there is just old junk, relics from the town's past. But there are a few pieces, like that compass, that have some interesting stories behind them. Some folks say the artifacts are cursed, that they hold the memories of the people who owned them. Sarah's stomach twisted at the word cursed. She wanted to laugh it off, but deep down, the idea didn't seem as ridiculous as it should have. Why does no one come to the museum? She asked, leaning forward. Tom sighed. People in this town have always been superstitious. The museum has a reputation. Some say it's haunted, others say it's bad luck. I think people just don't like being reminded of the past. It's easier to forget. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind spinning with questions. The museum, the artifacts, Captain Ellison's disappearance, everything seemed connected, but she couldn't quite see how. Yet. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, filled with thoughts of the museum and the strange things she had seen. She tossed and turned in bed, the sound of the ocean outside her window lulling her into a restless half-sleep. In her dream, she was standing in the museum again, alone in the dimly lit hall. The cracked mirror loomed before her, its surface dark and foreboding. As she approached, her reflection didn't move with her. It stayed still, watching her with cold, empty eyes. Behind her, the shadowy figure appeared again, closer this time. She tried to turn, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadow reached out, its hand brushing her shoulder, and Sarah woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up in bed, gasping for breath, the dream still vivid in her mind. It had felt so real, as if the shadow had been right there, in the room with her. She glanced around the dark bedroom, half expecting to see the figure standing in the corner, but she was alone. Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She needed air, needed to clear her head. She pulled on a jacket and stepped outside into the foggy night, the chill air biting at her skin. The streets were empty, the town eerily quiet. Sarah walked aimlessly, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. The museum, the artifacts, the shadow in the mirror, it was all starting to blur together, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. She found herself standing in front of the museum again, its dark silhouette looming in the fog. The building seemed to watch her, just like the artifacts inside. She shivered and turned away, heading back to her apartment, but the feeling of being watched followed her all the way home. The next morning, Sarah returned to the museum, determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. She spent hours poring over the old records and documents stored in the back room, searching for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. As she flipped through an old ledger, something caught her eye. It was a note, scribbled in the margin of one of the pages, written in a hand that was barely legible. The artifacts speak. We must listen. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The note was dated from over a century ago, written by one of the museum's early curators. Could they have experienced the same things she was going through now? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She moved back to the exhibit floor, her eyes scanning the artifacts with renewed suspicion. The compass, the mirror, the locket, they were all connected, she was sure of it. But how? And why? As she stood in front of the mirror again, she hesitated. The shadow, the figure, she had seen it twice now, both times in the reflection. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she raised her hand to touch the glass. Her fingers brushed the cold surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it again, the shadow, looming just behind her. This time, it was clearer, more defined. It wasn't just a blur or a trick of the light. It was a person. Sarah spun around, but once again, the room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, her hands shaking. The shadow was gone, but the fear it had left behind was very real. Chapter 4: The Stranger. The wind whipped fiercely around the corners of the museum as Sarah sat at her desk, the familiar quiet of the building settling around her. It had been a week since her encounter with the shadow in the mirror, and though she had tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, the unease had lingered. She couldn't focus, couldn't stop thinking about the artifacts. There was something more to them, something she wasn't seeing. That morning had been like any other, quiet and uneventful, until the bell above the museum's door rang softly. Sarah looked up from her desk, expecting one of the few locals who occasionally wandered in out of curiosity, but the man who entered was unfamiliar. He was tall, with sandy brown hair and a sharp, angular face. He wore a dark, tailored coat and carried himself with an air of confidence that seemed out of place in the sleepy town of Lincoln. His eyes, however, were what caught Sarah's attention. They were bright, almost unnaturally so, and they scanned the room with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Good morning," Sarah said, rising from her desk and forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt as though he was searching for something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and smooth. "I hope so. My name is Garrett, and I'm an antique dealer. I heard about your museum and thought I'd take a look at the collection." "An antique dealer?" Sarah repeated, her smile wavering slightly. It wasn't unusual for collectors or historians to visit, but something about this man made her uneasy. She couldn't quite place it, but there was something off, something that made her feel as though he wasn't telling the whole truth. Garrett nodded, his gaze drifting to the nearest exhibit. "Yes. I deal in rare artifacts, historical pieces. I've heard some interesting things about what you have here." Sarah hesitated. She wanted to ask him what he had heard, but something in his tone told her it was best to tread lightly. "Well, feel free to look around," she said, motioning toward the exhibits. "We have a variety of items, mostly from the town's early history." Garrett smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you." Sarah watched as Garrett moved through the museum, his movements deliberate and measured. He didn't seem like an ordinary visitor, he wasn't just glancing at the displays or reading the plaques. He studied each artifact with a sharp, discerning eye, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. When he reached the cracked mirror, he paused, his fingers lightly grazing the frame. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "That's one of our older pieces," she said, stepping closer. "It's been here since the museum opened." Garrett nodded, his fingers still hovering over the mirror's surface. "Interesting piece. Mirrors like this, they have a way of revealing things." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Garrett finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes, objects like this, they hold memories. Echoes of the people who owned them, the places they've been. If you know how to look, you can see those echoes." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The way he spoke, so matter-of-factly, made her uncomfortable. It was as if he knew something she didn't, something about the artifacts, about the mirror, that she had only begun to suspect. "Are you familiar with the history of this town?" Garrett asked, his gaze never leaving hers. "Somewhat," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been learning more since I started working here." Garrett smiled again, that same cold, unsettling smile. "Then you must know that this museum was built by the Ellison family. They were collectors, much like me. But their collection wasn't just for show. It was personal. Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had read about the Alisons, of course, but there hadn't been much information. Most of what she knew was tied to Captain Jeremiah Alison and his mysterious disappearance at sea. "What are you getting at?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Garrett tilted his head slightly, his eyes gleaming. "These objects, they have a way of keeping people close. Sometimes too close." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean by that?" Garrett stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I think you know. Haven't you felt it? The pull? These artifacts aren't just relics of the past. They're connected to you, to this place. And they're not done telling their story." Sarah stared at him, her heart racing. How could he know? She had never told anyone about the strange feelings she had experienced, the way the artifacts seemed to draw her in, as if they were trying to communicate with her. And yet, here was this stranger, speaking as though he knew everything. "What do you know about the Alisons?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharper than she had intended. Garrett's smile widened. "More than most. Let's just say I have an interest in their legacy." Sarah's mind reeled. There was something more to this man, something she couldn't quite grasp. He knew too much about the artifacts, about the museum, about her. "I'm not sure what you're trying to say," Sarah said, her voice strained. "But if you're here for something other than antiques, you need to tell me now." Garrett's expression darkened slightly, though his tone remained calm. "I'm here for the same reason you are, Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat. How did he know her name? She hadn't introduced herself, and there was no way he could have known who she was unless. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett chuckled softly. "I told you. I'm an antique dealer. But I also know a little more about these objects than most. I know what they're capable of." Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. This was too much. Too many coincidences, too many strange occurrences. She didn't trust him, not for a second, but she couldn't deny that he knew things she couldn't explain. "And how do you know so much about me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Garrett's eyes gleamed, and he leaned in closer. "Let's just say we have more in common than you think. I know about your dreams, Sarah. I know about the sea." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The dreams, how could he possibly know? She had told no one about the recurring visions of the sea, the waves crashing around her as she clung to a ship lost in a storm. It was a nightmare that had haunted her for weeks, ever since she had first touched the compass in the museum. Garrett's smile was cold and knowing. "The artifacts have chosen you, Sarah. Just like they chose me. You can't walk away from this." Sarah felt her stomach churn. The walls of the museum seemed to close in around her, the air thick with tension. She wanted to run, to get as far away from this man as possible, but something held her in place, something she couldn't explain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "But you need to leave." Garrett's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "I'll leave, for now. But you can't hide from this. You've already been pulled in. The museum, the artifacts, they're a part of you now. And they won't let go easily." With that, Garrett turned and walked out of the museum, the door closing softly behind him. Sarah stood frozen in place, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Who was he? And how did he know so much? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: Garrett wasn't just an antique dealer, and whatever he wanted, it had something to do with the museum. With her. As Sarah stood in the empty museum, the silence around her felt heavier than ever before. The artifacts seemed to hum with a new energy, as if they had been waiting for this moment, for Garrett's arrival. And now, more than ever, she felt their pull. But this time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was fear. Chapter 5, The Compass. The following days after Garrett's visit passed in a haze for Sarah. His words clung to her mind, replaying in fragments, like a riddle she couldn't solve. "The artifacts have chosen you, Sarah." The certainty in his voice, his unnerving knowledge of her dreams, it all gnawed at her, deepening her obsession with the museum's secrets. And at the center of it all was the compass. It sat on her desk, unmoving yet ever present. The brass had dulled over the years, but there was something about its weight in her hand, the way the needle flickered erratically when she touched it, that tugged at her. She couldn't ignore it any longer. This was more than a simple artifact, it was a key, she was sure of it. A key to something she needed to understand. She spent her mornings scouring the town archives, diving deep into records of Lincoln's founding families, and in particular, the Ellisons. Captain Jeremiah Ellison was a name she kept coming back to. There were stories about him, whispers of his obsession with the sea, the voices he claimed to hear, and then the fateful day he vanished with his crew, never to return. But there was more, she was certain of it. The compass had belonged to him, and now it had found its way into her hands. And with each day that passed, the pull it exerted on her grew stronger. Sarah sat in the diner across from Tom, her notebook filled with scrawled notes, clippings from old newspapers, and faded photographs spread out before her. The place was mostly empty, save for a couple of locals huddled in a corner booth, their conversation a quiet murmur in the background. Tom took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the notes she had made. "Jeremiah Ellison," he muttered, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "He's a name you hear a lot in the old stories around here. Him and the founding families of Lincoln, Ellison, McAllister, Reed. They all go way back." Sarah leaned in. "Do you know anything more specific? Anything about what might have happened to him?" Tom shrugged. "It's all speculation, really. The official story is that he took his ship, the Lorelei, out to sea and never came back. Some say he went mad, others think he was chasing something out there, something only he could see." "But what about the compass?" Sarah pressed. "It belonged to him. There's something more to it, I can feel it." Tom eyed her carefully, sensing her growing fixation. "People around here used to say the sea spoke to Jeremiah through that compass. That it led him to his fate." Sarah sat back, her mind racing. The compass, the voices, the connection to the sea, there was a thread here, something tying everything together. But what? What had Garrett meant when he said the artifacts were connected to her? As if reading her thoughts, Tom added, "You know, there are some who believe that the founding families didn't just come here by chance. There's talk of something binding them to this place. The compass might have been part of that." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Binding them how?" Tom shook his head. "Hard to say. But the old families, the Ellisons in particular, were always involved in things that went beyond just money and land. There were rumors of, well, call it a pact, if you will. Something with the sea." That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah couldn't sleep. The compass sat on her bedside table, its brass surface catching the dim light from the street lamp outside. She had brought it home with her earlier in the day, unable to leave it behind at the museum. The sea, the voices, the pull. What had Captain Ellison been chasing? And why did she feel as though she was being drawn down the same path? She lay in bed, staring at the compass, waiting for sleep to take her, but instead, the familiar sound of the ocean began to fill her ears. The roar of waves, the crash of the surf, growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear. And then, the needle on the compass twitched. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The needle spun, erratic at first, but then it settled, pointing north. But this wasn't true north. She knew that much. The compass had never pointed in a consistent direction since she had first touched it. But now, it was locked, the needle rigid as though it had found something specific. Her pulse quickened. What was it pointing toward? Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket and the compass, and slipped out the door, into the fog-drenched streets of Lincoln. The town was eerily quiet at this hour. The fog clung to the buildings like a living thing, distorting the world around her. But Sarah followed the compass, trusting its silent guidance. The needle didn't waver, pulling her steadily northward, through the winding streets, past the museum, past the old church, and out toward the outskirts of town. The houses here were older, more worn down, with peeling paint and broken fences. But the compass kept pulling her onward, leading her down a narrow, overgrown path she hadn't noticed before. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her mind raced. Where was it taking her? Finally, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there, half hidden by the fog and tangled undergrowth, was a house. It was old, its windows dark and its roof sagging with age. But something about it felt familiar, though Sarah couldn't remember ever seeing it before. She stood frozen, staring at the house, the compass still pointing unwaveringly toward it. Why had it led her here? The house was locked, the door swollen from years of neglect, but Sarah found an old window around the back that gave way with a little force. She climbed inside, her flashlight cutting through the dust-filled darkness. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and abandonment. But there was something else too, something she couldn't quite place. The house felt familiar, as though she had been here before. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the rooms, her flashlight catching glimpses of old furniture, faded wallpaper, and forgotten knickknacks. And then she saw it, a portrait hanging on the wall, its frame tarnished and its glass cracked. It was a portrait of a man in a naval uniform, his stern face frozen in time. Captain Jeremiah Ellison. Sarah's breath hitched. The compass in her hand trembled slightly, as though it had been waiting for her to see this. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the frame. The house, the compass, the portrait, it was all connected. But how? As she moved deeper into the house, she came across an old desk, its surface covered in dust. And there, sitting in the center, was a journal. Sarah's hands shook as she picked it up, her heart pounding in her ears. The journal was old, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. It belonged to Captain Ellison. And as Sarah read through the pages, a horrifying truth began to emerge. The captain had been chasing something he believed was calling to him from the sea. He had used the compass to guide him, convinced that it held the key to unlocking whatever was waiting for him out there. But as the journal went on, it became clear that Ellison had begun to lose his grip on reality. The voices, the pull, they had consumed him, leading him to his fate. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The compass had led her here, just as it had led Ellison all those years ago. But why? What was it trying to show her? Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The founding families, the sea, the compass, it was all connected. And somehow, she was tied to it all. She looked down at the compass in her hand, its needle still pointing toward the house, toward the past, toward a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But she had no choice. The compass had chosen her. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 6. The House. Sarah stood in the clearing, staring at the dilapidated house before her. The fog swirled around the overgrown path she had just walked, cloaking the house in an eerie silence. She gripped the compass tightly in her hand, its needle still pointing unwaveringly toward the building. This place, the house, held answers. She could feel it. She had barely slept since discovering Captain Ellison's journal in the house. The revelation that the compass had once belonged to him, guiding him toward some unknown fate, gnawed at her. And now, it had led her here. But why? What connection did this house have to the museum, to her family, to her own life? Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and memories of a time long forgotten. The dim light from her flashlight cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating the remnants of a life once lived. Faded photographs hung crookedly on the walls, their frames warped by time. Furniture lay in disarray, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. She moved cautiously through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The compass in her hand seemed to hum with energy, its pull growing stronger with every step she took. She followed its guidance, moving through the narrow hallways, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. At the end of the hallway, she found a small room, its door slightly ajar. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, revealing what appeared to be a study. The walls were lined with old, dusty books, and a large wooden desk sat in the center of the room, papers and journals scattered across its surface. But what caught Sarah's attention was a small, leather-bound journal lying open on the desk. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the leather worn and cracked from years of use. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It wasn't Captain Alison's journal this time, it was someone else's. And as she read, her breath caught in her throat. It was her grandmother's journal. Sarah sank into the old, creaking chair behind the desk, her mind spinning as she read through the journal. Her grandmother, Margaret Monroe, had worked at the museum decades ago, just like Sarah. The entries detailed her time as a curator, but there was something more, something darker. The artifacts, the compass, the mirror, they had been in the museum even back then. And according to her grandmother, they weren't just historical relics. They held power. The journal spoke of a connection, a bond between the museum and the Monroe family. Margaret had felt it too, the pull of the artifacts, the strange energy that surrounded them. She had written about how the artifacts seemed to speak to her, just as they had to Sarah. But there was something more, something Sarah hadn't anticipated. The final entries in the journal revealed that Margaret had been trying to uncover the truth about the museum and its connection to their family. She had discovered that the Monroe family had been tied to the museum for generations, long before she had ever worked there. And it wasn't by coincidence. The museum had chosen them. It had always chosen them. Sarah's heart raced as she read the final entry. The museum has a hold on us, stronger than I ever realized. It has manipulated my life, my choices. It isn't just a place, it's alive, and it's tied to our family in ways I can't explain. I fear that it has plans for us, plans that go beyond what I can comprehend. I must find a way to break free, but I don't know if that's possible. If you're reading this, Sarah, be careful. The museum is not what it seems. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the journal, her mind reeling. Her grandmother had known. She had tried to warn her. But it was too late. The museum had already drawn Sarah in, just as it had with Margaret. And now, there was no escaping it. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the museum, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She clutched her grandmother's journal tightly in her hand as she entered the building, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for her, standing near the front desk as though she had expected Sarah's return. "You've found it, haven't you?" Mrs. Patterson's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a knowing edge. Sarah nodded, unable to hide the shock and anger in her voice. "You knew. You knew about my grandmother. About the museum's connection to my family. And you didn't say anything." Mrs. Patterson sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I had hoped you wouldn't find out this way. But yes, I knew your grandmother. She worked here many years ago, just like you. And yes, I know about the museum's connection to your family. Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. "Why didn't you warn me?" Mrs. Patterson met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because you had to find out for yourself. It's the way it's always been. The museum, it chooses who it wants, and it chose you. Just like it chose your grandmother, and her mother before her." Sarah stared at her, her mind spinning. "What are you talking about? What do you mean, it chooses?" Mrs. Patterson took a step closer, her voice lowering. "The museum is not just a building. It's more than that. It's alive, in a way. The artifacts inside it, they hold power. They have a way of calling to certain people, drawing them in. And for generations, your family has been tied to that power. The museum has always had a special connection to the Monroe family. It's why you're here. Sarah shook her head, disbelief washing over her. No. This is insane. My life, it's not some game for the museum to control. I'm afraid it's more complicated than that, Mrs. Patterson said softly. The museum has been guiding you your entire life, Sarah. Every decision you've made, every path you've taken, it's all been leading you here. Sarah's knees felt weak, and she sank into a nearby chair, her head spinning. The weight of the realization hit her like a freight train. Her entire life, every choice, every moment had it all been manipulated. Was she just a pawn in some twisted game orchestrated by the museum? That night, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at the compass on the table in front of her. Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. The museum had been controlling her life, guiding her toward this moment. But why? What did it want from her? Her grandmother had tried to break free, but she had failed. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped, just like Margaret had been. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle. The compass's needle twitched, catching Sarah's attention. It spun slowly, pointing toward the window. Toward the sea. The voices. The pull. The sea. It had all started with the sea. Sarah stood, her resolve hardening. She had to confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. She had to find out what the museum wanted, and why it had chosen her. She grabbed the compass and her grandmother's journal, determined to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. Whatever the museum's plans were, she wouldn't let it control her any longer. The following morning, Sarah returned to the house on the outskirts of town. The fog was thicker than ever, the air heavy with tension as she approached the abandoned building. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew this was where she would find the answers. The house loomed before her, silent and foreboding. As she stepped inside, the compass began to vibrate in her hand, its needle spinning wildly. She followed its pull, moving deeper into the house until she reached the small study once again. This time, however, something was different. The air felt charged, electric, as though the house itself was alive. And then, she saw it. On the wall, behind the portrait of Captain Ellison, was a small, hidden door. Her heart pounded as she approached it, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before descending into the unknown, the compass guiding her every step. Whatever was waiting for her at the bottom, she was ready to face it. The museum had controlled her life for too long. It was time to take back control. Chapter 7: The Mosaic. The cold air pressed against Sarah as she descended the narrow staircase into the dark, hidden basement beneath the house. Each step felt heavier, as if something in the shadows was waiting for her, tugging at her resolve. The compass vibrated in her hand, the needle pointing unerringly forward, guiding her into the depths of the unknown. When her feet touched the concrete floor, she swung her flashlight in a slow arc, illuminating the space around her. It was a small, cramped cellar lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of dusty boxes and forgotten relics. In the center of the room sat a single table, its surface covered in old books and papers, and at the far end, a tall cabinet stood locked with a rusted iron keyhole. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The atmosphere felt charged, like the very air around her was humming with secrets. She approached the table, her eyes scanning the books and papers scattered across it. The documents were old, some so brittle they crumbled at her touch, but the words that remained were clear enough. They were records of the artifacts. Inventory lists, letters, and contracts, all detailing the history of the objects in the museum. And then she saw it, her family name, Monroe, scrawled across several pages. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the letters. It was addressed to her grandmother. Margaret. The museum is no longer a simple collection of history. It has become something more alive, perhaps. The artifacts, they call to us, and in turn, they demand something. They have chosen us, the Monroe family, to keep their power contained. But the price we pay for that responsibility is high. Be careful, Margaret. I fear the museum will take more from us than we are willing to give. RJ. Ellison. Sarah's pulse quickened as she set the letter down. Her grandmother had known. She had been aware of the connection between the artifacts, the museum, and their family. And it had been more than just a familial duty. The artifacts demanded something in return for the power they held, something that had haunted her family for generations. She turned her attention to the locked cabinet at the far end of the room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached it, the rusted keyhole gleaming in the dim light. With shaking hands, she pulled out the old iron key she had found in the desk upstairs, praying that it would fit. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the cabinet door creaked open. Inside were more relics, artifacts that had been hidden away, forgotten by time. But these were different. These were personal. Among the items was a small portrait of her grandmother, much younger, standing in front of the museum. Next to it, a silver locket, and beneath that, a small, intricately carved wooden box. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of the box before slowly lifting the lid. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a ring, a simple gold band engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. As she picked it up, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. She caught herself against the cabinet, steadying her breath. The ring felt warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Back in the museum the following day, Sarah sat at her desk, the ring resting in front of her alongside the compass and the journal. The pieces were coming together, but the full picture remained elusive. The artifacts weren't just random objects. They were tied to her family's past, and somehow, they held the key to her future. But the more she thought about it, the more a terrible realization began to form. The museum didn't just choose her, it had been orchestrating her life from the beginning. She had always wondered why her life had felt so directionless, why every attempt at finding a new path had led her back to Lincoln, back to the museum. And now, she understood. It hadn't been her choices at all. The museum had been pulling the strings, leading her here, preparing her for this moment. The door to the museum creaked open, breaking Sarah's thoughts. She looked up to see Garrett standing in the doorway, his familiar dark coat trailing behind him as he stepped inside. He gave her a small, knowing smile. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and almost sympathetic. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Garrett? Who are you?" Garrett approached her desk slowly, his eyes scanning the artifacts in front of her. "I told you before, I'm an antique dealer. But that's only part of the story. Like you, I'm tied to this place. The artifacts. They've chosen me, too." Sarah recoiled slightly. "What do you mean, chosen?" Garrett's smile faded, and his expression grew serious. "The artifacts are more than just historical objects. They're conduits, links between the past and the present. They hold power, but that power comes at a cost. Someone has to maintain the balance, to keep the artifacts contained. That's where we come in." Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. "No. I didn't choose this. I don't want any part of it." Garrett's eyes softened. "None of us do. But it doesn't change the fact that the museum has already chosen you. You can feel it, can't you? The pull? The way the artifacts call to you." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to deny it, to tell Garrett that he was wrong. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had felt the pull, just as her grandmother had. The museum wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it had been shaping her life since before she was even born. What do the artifacts want? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's gaze met hers, his expression unreadable. They want control. And in exchange, they offer us protection. But that protection comes at a price. What kind of price? Sarah's voice trembled. The museum has always required a curator, Garrett explained. Someone to watch over the artifacts, to maintain the balance. And once the museum chooses you, there's no going back. You either accept your role, or you risk losing everything. Sarah's stomach twisted as the weight of Garrett's words settled over her. So, what? I'm supposed to just give up my life and become some sort of caretaker for these things? Garrett's expression softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of empathy in his eyes. It's not just about you. The museum has always been tied to your family. Your grandmother knew it. She tried to resist, but in the end, the museum took her, too. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Her grandmother had spent her life trying to uncover the truth, trying to break free from the museum's hold, but in the end, she had failed. And now, it was Sarah's turn to make a choice. That night, Sarah stood alone in the museum, the artifacts spread out before her. The compass, the ring, the mirror, the locket, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, a mosaic that was finally beginning to make sense. Each artifact represented a moment in her family's lineage, passed down through generations, binding them to the museum. But now, the choice was hers. She could stay and accept her role as the curator, maintaining the balance between the artifacts and the outside world. Or she could leave and risk the consequences of abandoning her destiny. Her mind swirled with doubt. Was this her fate? Had she ever really had a choice? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, suffocating her with its gravity. Garrett's words echoed in her mind, once the museum chooses you, there's no going back. The museum had already taken so much from her. Her grandmother, her sense of freedom, her future, it had all been shaped by forces beyond her control. But now, standing in the heart of the museum, Sarah realized something else. The museum might have chosen her, but it didn't control her. Not yet. She had a choice. With trembling hands, she picked up the compass, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The needle spun slowly, pointing once again toward the sea. The artifacts demanded something in return, control over her fate. But Sarah wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. She placed the compass back on the table and turned toward the door. The museum could wait. For now, she would decide her own path. Chapter 8, The Choice. The museum was still, a quiet that hummed with tension. Sarah stood in the center of the main room, her eyes locked on the artifacts that now felt like more than just relics of the past. The compass lay on the table, the mirror reflected only shadowed corners, and the locket, so small and fragile, seemed heavier than it had ever been. They had all shaped her life in ways she was only now beginning to understand. The air was thick, like the moments before a storm, and Sarah could feel the weight of a decision looming over her. The museum had been in control of her family for generations, bending their lives to its will. And now, it had chosen her. But she had a choice. Didn't she? The door to the museum creaked open, breaking the silence. Mrs. Patterson stepped inside, her familiar figure framed by the dim light spilling in from the street. Her expression was calm, almost resigned, as if she had been expecting this confrontation. "I wondered when this moment would come, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice soft but filled with an unspoken gravity. "I've seen it before, you know. With your grandmother." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You never told me. You never told me that my grandmother tried to break free." Mrs. Patterson sighed, her gaze flickering toward the artifacts. "Your grandmother was strong, Sarah. Stronger than most. She fought against the museum's influence for years. But in the end, she couldn't escape it. None of us can." "I don't believe that," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "There has to be a way." Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, her eyes piercing. "You've felt it, haven't you? The pull? The way the museum shapes your thoughts, your decisions. It's not just a place, Sarah. It's alive. And it has always chosen its curators. It chose your grandmother. It chose you." Sarah shook her head, anger bubbling up inside her. "No. It's manipulated me. It's controlled my life, just like it controlled hers. But I won't let it. I won't let it take me." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "Your grandmother said the same thing. She believed she could escape it. She even tried to run. But the museum has a way of pulling you back. It always does." Sarah's mind raced. Her grandmother had tried to break free, but she had failed. She had spent her life fighting against the museum's hold, only to be consumed by it in the end. But Sarah wasn't ready to accept that fate. "Not yet. There has to be another way," Sarah said, her voice wavering. "I can choose, can't I? I can walk away." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "If you leave, you'll lose everything. The museum will take back what it's given you. Your family, your past, it's all tied to this place. You may think you're choosing freedom, but you're choosing to sever yourself from everything that's made you who you are." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She had always known that the museum was more than just a collection of artifacts. She had felt it from the beginning, the way it called to her, the way it seemed to know her deepest thoughts. But standing here now, at the edge of a decision that would change everything, she was faced with the stark reality of what that meant. The artifacts were not just objects. They were alive, in their own way. They were part of a larger force, a living entity that had shaped the lives of everyone connected to the museum. And Sarah had been chosen to be its next caretaker, its next curator. But at what cost? Her mind raced back to Garrett's words, the way he had spoken about the artifacts and their power. He, too, had been drawn into the museum's orbit, just like her. But he had accepted his role, hadn't he? He had chosen to be part of it. Sarah looked down at the compass, its needle twitching slightly as if it were sensing her turmoil. The choice before her was clear: stay and accept her role as the curator, bound to the museum and its power forever, or walk away and sever the ties that had connected her family to this place for generations. But walking away came with its own price. Mrs. Patterson was right, her life had been shaped by the museum, by her family's connection to it. If she left, would she lose everything? Would the memories of her grandmother, of her family's history, fade away? Would she become a stranger to herself, cut off from the legacy that had defined her? "I won't be controlled," Sarah said finally, her voice low but firm. "I won't let the museum take away my choices." Mrs. Patterson's expression was unreadable. "Then you must decide, Sarah. The museum won't wait forever." The next morning, Sarah found herself standing on the cliffs overlooking the sea, the wind tugging at her hair as the waves crashed below. She had come here to clear her mind, to find some sense of clarity in the chaos that had engulfed her life. The sea had always been a part of this story. It had called to her in her dreams, just as it had called to Captain Ellison all those years ago. And now, standing here on the edge of the world, Sarah felt its pull more strongly than ever. The compass was in her hand, the needle pointing out toward the horizon. It had led her here, just as it had led her to the house, just as it had guided her every step since she had first touched it. But now, she wondered, was the compass leading her to her fate, or was it offering her a way out? The museum had shaped her life in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. It had been a silent force, guiding her decisions, manipulating her choices. And now, it demanded something in return. It demanded control. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up her freedom. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to the museum, the weight of her decision pressing down on her with every step. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for her, standing near the front desk with a look of quiet anticipation. "Well, Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice gentle. Have you made your choice? Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. I have. Mrs. Patterson's gaze softened. And what will it be? For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The artifacts around her seemed to hum with energy, as if they, too, were waiting for her decision. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice clear and steady. I won't let the museum control me. I won't let it shape my life any longer. I'm walking away. Mrs. Patterson's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps sadness, or perhaps understanding, in her eyes. You know what that means, don't you? Sarah nodded. I know. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah packed up her apartment, made arrangements to leave Lincoln, and prepared to say goodbye to the town that had been both a home and a prison for her. But as the day of her departure drew closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The museum, with all its secrets, still held a piece of her heart. She had spent so much time searching for answers, uncovering the truth about her family's connection to the artifacts, and now she was walking away from it all. Was she making the right choice? Or was she running from something she was destined to face? On the morning of her departure, Sarah made one final visit to the museum. The air inside was still, the artifacts resting in their cases, as if they, too, were waiting to see what she would do. She stood in front of the compass, her hand resting on its cool brass surface. The needle didn't move. It was as if the compass had gone silent, its purpose fulfilled. For a long moment, Sarah stared at the artifacts, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had made her choice. She was walking away. But as she turned to leave, a voice stopped her in her tracks. You can still change your mind. It was Garrett. He stood in the doorway, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, regret. Sarah turned to face him, her heart pounding. I've made my choice. Garrett nodded slowly. I know. But sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones we're meant to make. As Sarah walked away from the museum for the last time, the weight of her decision settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had chosen freedom, but the cost of that freedom was steep. She would never know what might have been if she had stayed, if she had embraced the museum's power. But in the end, she had chosen her own path. And for now, that was enough. Do you think Sarah could have made a different choice? What alternatives could she have explored in this tangled web of freedom and duty? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed the book, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories.